Michael, we agreed that you were going to pretty much run with this, but if I may just ask an opening question. Thanking you so much, I guess, for writing a book about Wagner, because there are so few. And I would love to know what it was that prompted you to say, you know, what the world needs is a book on Wagner.
A book on Wagner, that's an absolutely fair question. And I'm not sure this book would have come into being had it not been for the pandemic, to be quite honest, because my life is in St Andrews, where I work at the university, is very busy with lots of weekly activity, putting on concerts, conducting choirs, organising operas, that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, all of that was taken away. And so I thought, you know, how am I going to fill my time? And after I'd learned how to bake sourdough bread and watched a lot of miserable Scandinavian television, as so many people did in the pandemic, I thought, well, now's the time maybe to try and get to grips with some big things that I've always wanted to know more about. And as you will agree, I'm sure they don't come much bigger than The Ring. So I really sort of thought, you know, how do I get to grips with this? And I started looking around the literature. As you've said, it isn't exactly sparse, the literature on The Ring. But I found slightly to my surprise that there wasn't, I think, a recent, I'm going to hedge my bets a little here, but I didn't think that there was a recent English language book that treated The Ring as something for newcomers, in other words, that didn't assume any prior knowledge either of Wagner's life or of musical notation or of musical technicalities, and took the reader from the beginning, trying to explain why and how he wrote it. So, I mean, I've, over the last 4 years, kept waiting for someone to contradict me on that assertion that there wasn't such a book, but slightly to my surprise, and certainly to my relief, no one has contradicted me. So that's the book I tried to set out to write. I'm aware that the audience gathered here, in a way, isn't my target audience. You know, this is a book definitely written for someone who doesn't know anything about Wagner, but is maybe Wagner curious, maybe goes to a lot of Mozart, a lot of Puccini, and is thinking about trying The Ring. That was the person I had in mind. Some of the reviews have been kind enough to say that there are things in it that Wagner experts or, you know, seasoned Wagnerians will find interesting, or treating the subject from a new angle, and that's great. I mean, that feels like a nice bonus to me. But it was really a book sort of intended to take the subject from the beginning, you know, in a fresh way.
There are certainly lots of things in this book that I didn't know, and I rather fancy myself pretty well read in Wagner and The Ring. But there's just an awful lot of good stuff in it. Talk to us about how the book came about.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose in my previous career, both musical and academic, I describe myself as Wagner curious, a phrase I've already used once today, rather than Wagner obsessive. I think my nearest and dearest will probably say that I'm now definitely tipping over into the obsessive category, which is probably a myth from which there's no extricating oneself. But a lot of my work has been on people who are connected with Wagner in one way or the other. So my PhD was on Debussy, and more specifically on Debussy's musical journalism. And as I'm sure a lot of you will know, Debussy is almost the archetype of someone who has a love-hate relationship with Wagner. He was obsessed with him as a young man. He described himself, I think, as obsessed to the point of impoliteness. When he was writing Pelléas around the turn of the century, he described himself as having to tear up pages because the ghost of old Klingsor kept coming round the corner. But as a mature writer, he he said some rather rude things about Wagner. I rather like the wit, so I'll read you a couple of them. Wagner has set us a number of precedents in how to fashion music for the theatre. One day we shall see how useless they all are. And then another one, Wagner, if one may be permitted a little of the grandiloquence that suits the man, was a beautiful sunset that has been mistaken for a dawn. I think it's important to quote that with the grandiloquence that suits the man bit. It's often quoted without that, which makes Diffusy himself sound grandiloquent, which he wasn't really. But I think with Debussy, there's an element of protesting too much. You know, clearly Wagner was, if not the defining feature, one of the defining features of his life. And then, by chance almost, a few years after I finished my doctorate, I was asked by Weidenfeld and Nicholson to work on the English language version of the book by Nike Wagner, which I'm sure some of you will know, that were translated into English as the Wagners, Dramas of a Musical Dynasty. And Nike's relationship to her family's history and to her great-grandfather's work is fascinating, but definitely oblique, to put it mildly. And then a little further on, I found myself working on the music of Jonathan Harvey, a wonderful British composer who's, I think, reasonably well known in the US. He was at Stanford University for a while, and Jonathan wrote an opera called Wagner Dream, which intersperses an imagining of the last moments of Wagner's life and a furious row with Cosimo, and that's sort of intercut with an imagined realization of the Buddhist drama that Wagner planned but never completed, Die Sieger. And so talking to Jonathan a lot about Wagner, I think what I'm saying really is I'd approached Wagner from various different angles and got to know people either in real life or through reading who were obsessed by Wagner but also repelled. And so I suppose that heightened my fascination with the man and his work, and made me, ready at this stage of my career to try and confront Wagner directly for the first time.
And I haven't heard you say that at 18 you were standing in the back of the Colosseum and listening to Wagner performances or anything like that.
No, and that's because I wasn't, actually. I came, I think, fairly late to Wagner, and it from a rather peculiar angle. My own first experience of the ring is seared on my memory, I have to say. Rather bizarrely, it was Götterdämmerung. So that was the first one that I saw, although I suppose appropriately it was the first one that Wagner conceived. I saw that at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden in 1995. And Bernard Eiting's conducting of the music is absolutely sort of fresh in my mind, but also Richard Jones's visual images, in particular the image of Deborah Pulaski sort of coming into the Giebelchungs Hall with a paper bag on her head, and the sense of humiliation was so well portrayed by Richard Jones, and the fall of Valhalla with just a lot of cardboard boxes actually, but somehow through the magic of what Richard Jones did in the theatre. So I had that experience from my first live encounter with Wagner that I'm sure probably everyone in this room could report a different experience in some or other place. And so I got the bug on that evening.
Yeah, well, exactly. But you also had these sort of splintered, distinct experiences of working with a contemporary composer, of working with Wagner's great granddaughter, and so how did you? Here came the pandemic. How did you conceive it? In other words, I understand you to say you wanted to write something in English for the general audience to satisfy a curiosity about who is Wagner and what is the ring?
Yeah, that's right. Where did it come from? I think I also wanted to approach it from all the different possible angles, because the ring, as we all know, is many different things, isn't it? I mean, purely as a musical score, it's revolutionary and groundbreaking, but also as a piece of drama, it's extraordinary. Some people would say it's a philosophical tract. Other people would disagree with that and say it's not. As a piece of orchestration, Peter and I have been talking this week about Wagner's orchestral innovations, but it's a handbook of how to write for the orchestra. It's a piece of philology, drawing together all these different mythological sources in an extraordinary way. And so I think rather ambitiously, I thought I'm going to try and do all of these things. I'm going to try and look at it in the round rather than doing the more sensible academic thing of finding a tiny little piece of it that no one had ever looked at before. So that was my project.
And that, in fact, is the structure of the books, it turns out, that it's biography and then rumination on the work and then biography, and right?
Yeah, so I think the hardest part of the book by far was deciding how to structure it. People say, how long did it take to write? And I mean, the honest answer is it took about 2 years of thinking about it and how to structure it. And then after I'd done that, I wrote it quite quickly in a year to 18 months. But I suppose the biggest decision, and I would say the best decision, at least for me, was, and there were two obvious ways of structuring a book about a piece of music or about the ring. One is chronological. This is what he did in the 1840s, what he did in the 1850s, etc. The other is thematic. These are his sources. This is what he did with the orchestra. This is how he wrote for singers. So I decided to do both at the same time, which was challenging, but I'm pleased I did it that way. So there is a continuous narrative. Being Wagner, it's a narrative that occasionally digresses and goes backwards and forwards and has flashbacks. But I try very hard to keep the sense of a present moving forward from the 1840s where I start the story. But also each of the 7 chapters has a theme. So the first one is about Wagner's experiences as Kapellmeister in Saxony before the uprising and what his organizational activities brought to the project of the ring. Second chapter is about sources, his use of sources. The third chapter is about the libretto. The fourth, which is a massive chapter, it's really 4 chapters, is about the music. The fifth is about how he raised the money, and Wagner societies, such as the Precursors of your own, play an enormous part in this. And the 6th chapter is about how he actually put it on, his work as director. I then stop the story abruptly at the end of the first performance of Götterdämmerung, but I write a 7th chapter, which we may talk about a bit later, where I look at reinterpretations of the ring in the 150 years after that first performance.
Yeah, I would add that you also adopt a tone, almost journalistic tone of you always start each chapter with 29 October 1846. Wagner's walking down the street, and you write it in the present tense, sort of as and it lends it a kind of urgency and a narrative enjoyment. It's a fun read.
I mean, thank you. I mean,
you're a good storyteller.
Well, no, thank you very much. So that was, I suppose, the other big decision that I took at an early stage was to write not all the book, but most of the book in the present tense. And this was I mean, I've never, most of my previous writing has been respectable academic stuff. And so this was a departure for me. And I hit on it as a way of writing chapter 1, because chapter 1, I wanted to focus on Wagner in the 1840s, because I think it's after he takes up the post as Royal Saxon Kapellmeister that he really starts to acquire the experiences that lead him 30 years later to put on the ring. So I wanted to go very deeply into that period. Equally, there are things in his previous life, such as the difficulties in Paris and the difficulties of putting on his first opera, Das Liebesverbot, that needed to be mentioned. So I hit on the idea of telling the Dresden stuff, or making the Dresden stuff the present, and telling all that in the present tense, but then including 3 flashbacks to different parts of his past experience, not that far in the past, but from 1820s, 1830s. And so it was an alternation of 7 sections, the 4 outer ones in the present tense and the 3 inner ones in the past tense. And that was very much an experiment for me. And I sent it rather nervously to 3 or 4 trusted friends, all of whom really liked that way of doing it. It said you beat to that it was fun and it made it accessible. So I decided to do the rest of the book like that, which wasn't a decision I'd taken at the outset. And it felt like an experiment. Some critics haven't liked that, but more people have seemed to like it. So I'm glad to have done it that way.
Well, you mentioned that first chapter about Dresden, and it was in that chapter that I first came across several things that I had no idea about, that just struck me as entirely new, entirely fresh. And in the Dresden chapter, there was a reference to the library that is in Wanfried. When I first visited Wanfried in 1981, I was quite overwhelmed by the beauty of the large music room and the extraordinary collection of beautifully bound, leather-spined, gorgeous, hundreds of books. But there's a story that you tell.
There is a story. So Wagner, when he got this position as Royal Saxon Kapellmeister in 1843, started to, well, firstly he was earning money for the first time in his life, but he assembled a big library in those 6 years in Dresden. We have Minna to thank. I mean, Minna doesn't get a very good press often, but she compiled a list of Wagner's books, which...
And not only did he buy them, but he spent money...
He spent money getting them beautifully bound. That's right. And there's, I think, about almost 200 listed by Minna. And they give us an insight into Wagner's ambition at this stage of his life. There's a lot of works of German mythology, a lot of academic works, a lot of Nordic mythology, and it's from that list really that we can reconstruct what he was reading. But the story that you alluded to is that he had to leave them when he fled Dresden in a great hurry. In 1849. His brother-in-law, Heinrich Brockhaus, held them as security for a loan, needless to say, one of the hundreds of loans that was made to Wagner, and needless to say, Wagner never repaid it. And the Brockhaus family held on to the books. And I think, as I say,
they held on to the books for a century.
Yes, a century.
Right? Exactly right. Collateral for this loan.
Yes. Yeah.
And then finally somebody melts and decides to give
them. Yeah.
So it must have been I think they gave them, according to your book, I think they gave them to Ventry in like 1974.
I think, yes,
right?
yeah.
So I must have been worth it. And I had these dreams of, oh, Wagner must have sat here and leafed through this book. Not so.
And I'm sure he acquired some more.
Yeah, but those were collateral for a loan. Who knew?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So it's fascinating, and we have access to library borrowings and records of him borrowing things from the Dresden Royal Library, and not always giving them back as well.
Yeah, well, if we may, let's just go a little farther with this fact that what was not there were Bach partitas. What was not there was Beethoven scores. What was not there was musical theory. What was not there were Haydn piano sonatas. What was there were plays, mythology, narratives, stories, fairy tales. Yes, it's the library of someone who is a dramatist.
Yes, yeah, and a man of the theatre, and of someone with a project. It's a project.
Yes, but he's not studying harmony, is he? He's studying stories.
That's what we have the evidence of. I mean, he must have helped the music, or had access to the music as well. I mean, we know how obsessive he was about Beethoven, and I think he was 18 when he made an arrangement of or a transcription of the Ninth Symphony, and tried to make some money out of it. But no, you're right. The emphasis of what he spent his money on in the early to mid 1840s is definitely theatre.
Right. All right, so there you are. You've decided to go ahead and do this project. You sort of have the structure of it in your mind. And I should think now you open up the door and you see 10,000 existing volumes on Wagner. So how did you go about climbing that mountain?
Yeah. Yes. So, I have a very large bookshelf at home. Do you have IKEA here? Does that mean anything? Yeah, I have a large IKEA bookshelf, which is completely full of Wagner books, and then more overflowing on the floor. And it's terrible. I have to wade through Wagner books. I wish I could say that I have read every word in all of those books, but I have a busy job and a 5-year-old child, so I haven't read them all. And that was another challenge, because I mean I'm being commissioned to write a book on Elgar as my next book, and I'm going to have a fair crack at reading every book that's been written about Elgar, and that doesn't seem unmanageable. There might be 40 or so. I haven't actually added it up, but I mean, it's unimaginable to me to be able to read everything that's written about Wagner. So I read as much as I could, but then at a certain point decided to stop and start writing. What was very helpful actually was the pressure of the 150th anniversary, because I think one of the reasons my UK publishers, Faber Faber, were keen to take it on was because as we all know, next year is the 150th anniversary of The Ring, and so they were keen to have it out well before that, as companies across the world are sort of starting to think of that.
But you didn't just sit and you study and read, did you?
No.
You traveled around.
Yeah, I traveled around because at the point I conceived the book, although I had seen all the parts of The Ring several times in the theatre, I'd never seen them in the right order in 1 week, which I know is something that lots of you here will have done many times, but for various reasons, partly living in Scotland, where the last staged Ring was 25 years ago. I hadn't done that. So obviously I had to do that in order to make the book feel authentic. And so within the early period within the period of writing it, I saw it 4 times all the way through. all of it in Germany actually, which I'm sure inflects my approach. So I saw the Stefan Herheim ring at the Deutsche Oper Berlin twice, and I also saw Rosalind Gilmore's ring at the Leipzig Opera, which I know you saw as well, Peter. Although you had more stamina than me because you saw all 13 of the words. I didn't quite manage that. And I saw Willy Decker's ring at Dresden, conducted by Christian Thielemann as well. So I did immerse myself quite a lot. As you'll find out if you read the book, the Herheim ring made a particular impact on me. He's a director I already admired through seeing his productions of Salome and Pelléas and Mélisande elsewhere. But I saw the ring, his ring in Berlin in early 2022 in what was a rather extraordinary period, because we were, as we all know, coming out of the pandemic. But I booked my tickets in September 2021, as soon as they came out, and I got a lovely seat right in the middle of the front row of the stalls, right behind Donald Runnicles, and it was all going to be wonderful. And then in December, the German government said that because the cases of COVID were rising so quickly in the UK, we weren't allowed to go to Germany. So with a very heavy heart, I sold all my tickets. And then on the 27th of, I think it was 27th or 28th of December, the German government said, actually, no, it's all right, you can come in again from the 4th of January. The 4th of January was the day where Rheingold was happening. So I went right on, I rebought all my tickets, except for Goethe Dämmerung. Someone had bought my front row, so I had to sit in the second row for that. But I rebought all my own tickets. I got literally the first plane out of London that was allowed into Germany, and it felt like a sort of wartime mission. So I was going to see this way, and without repeating everything that's in the book, the bureaucracy that was required to see the ring, or indeed anything, was extraordinary. I had to produce 4 documents. I had to produce proof of double vaccination, proof that I'd had a COVID test that day, a passport and a ticket. And I was just so terrified of getting COVID that I didn't go to any public transport or barely any other public venues. But anyway, I didn't get COVID, and I saw the whole ring, and it would have been an extraordinary experience anyway, but somehow the intensity of having been deprived of live music for such a long time, and then the live music I saw was sitting just behind the ring, certainly the intensity of the situation enhanced the experience. I think it's fair to say.
Was it during that trip that you visited Wagners?
Yes, that's right. It was. So I made a extra trip to visit Bayreuth, and it was January, and it was during a global pandemic, so there weren't a lot of tourists around. And so, and amazingly, that library, I was there on my own for a morning, which was amazing. Yeah, very inspiring.
So, having done all the field work, I guess there's nothing for it but to sit down and begin to get intellectual obstacles rather than physical ones.
That's right. Yeah. So, as I say, I had the structure by this stage fairly clearly mapped out, and what bits of the story I was going to tell in the present tense, what I was going to do flashbacks to. And the hardest part definitely was the chapter about the music, because even though it's by far the longest chapter, it could have been so much longer. I got about 5,000 words in, and I barely got through a third of the first scene of Rheingold, and it was terrible. And I was just sort of trying to write everything that was of interest to me, and that's the only bit of the book I actually discarded. The rest I wrote and edited and polished and so on, but I didn't discard any. But I discarded a first draft of the section on Rheingold.
Tell me again, other than that it was simply verbose, what was fundamentally wrong with what you'd written?
What was wrong was that I was trying to deal with all of the compositional parameters at all the time. So I was trying to say everything he did. And so the decision I took on the music chapter was to essentially trust the reader that if I talked about something in relation to one of the dramas, the reader would then apply what I'd said to the others. And then that was the crucial decision. So in the Rheingold chapter, I mean, this makes it sound more schematic than it actually is. But in the Rheingold chapter, I talk quite a lot about the instrumental sounds and the use of the orchestra. In the Valkyrie chapter, I talk about the leitmotivic structure and deal with the whole thorny issues of leitmotifs. I suppose another important decision I took very early on with my publisher's encouragement was not to include any music examples. And actually, that was the right decision. I mean, I mainly did that. Well, they were keen that because music examples add enormously to the cost of producing it. But actually, somehow I think if someone who is not musically expert sees a book with music examples, they might be put off and think, oh no, this isn't for me. So I was quite keen not to have music examples. But also I rather liked the challenge it set me as a writer, because it meant that I had to, if I wanted to talk about the sword motive or whatever it was, I had to find a way of describing it in a way that would be intelligible without assuming any musical literacy. So it's the same with the leitmotifs. I try and find a way of explaining it, focusing on Act 1 of Die Walküre, which is probably my favorite act of the whole thing. I'm sure I'm not followed in that, and I just sort of try and find a way of dealing with it, which I hope my readers will then apply elsewhere. So and to answer your original question, what was wrong with the first draft? As I tried to do everything up the time, and I couldn't bring it. But
Ladies, with respect to what ended up being published, I was very struck by an observation that you made when you were talking about the opening of Scene 2 of Rheingold and Vollendet ist das ewige Werk. You mentioned that he kept looking for an instrument. He was scoring that for an instrument that didn't exist. And so he kept on spending time, and this is well after having written it.
yes,
He just knew that the orchestra that he was writing for wasn't the orchestra that was the sound that he had in his mind. So he had to. So he was looking at the sax, the saxophone, the inventor, and he was looking for, and he ended up creating a bass trumpet or a bass. A trombone or something or a Wagner horn.
That's right.
When I just find that it's particularly the way you frame it in the book. This guy's a bit, nuts. I mean, everybody else composes for the orchestra.
for instruments that exist.
And here we have somebody who is writing a play for a theater that doesn't exist, using instruments that don't exist. But it merrily goes along for 26 years. No, this is fine. I mean, that's a bit...
It is nuts, isn't it? Yeah. It's
I can't imagine someone who goes about his work that way.
extraordinary, but he has a sound in his mind that I think it in respect to instruments, but actually in respect to everything, what really struck me while I was researching, and what I hope will come across to readers, is the combination of idealism and practicality, actually. And so I deliberately start the book. Sorry, this is digressing from your point, but I'll come back to your point. I deliberately start the book by outlining a plan that Wagner has for reorganizing the orchestra in Dresden, and he talks about things like what seats will they sit on, and how long will their lunch breaks be, and how much will they be paid, and things like that. And I'm doing that as a sort of deliberate corrective to the idea that he's a sort of dreamy visionary. Of course, he's a dreamy visionary as well, but I think what is so unusual is the combination of great attention to detail, but then also the sort of ability to imagine something that doesn't yet exist.
Right.
Did you? Yeah, I think both are important. I think one.
Well, yeah, I guess. I still just find it to be dynamically confusing in my own mind. I was speaking to the guy who plays the English horn in the Bayreuth Orchestra. And he said, in Tristan, my part is not called the cor anglais. The thing they put on my music stand has alto oboe. It's an alto oboe instrument that was made at Wagner's behest in Bayreuth just before.
And you sang that wonderful.
Yeah. And then he said, well, actually, anywhere in my past scores where I wrote English horn, use the alto oboe instead. I think this guy's nuts. This guy is not well. He's living in a world other than the world that is. And I understand you're saying practicality, but at core, the work that he does is work that he had to invent.
Yes.
We haven't talked about the final chapter. I wonder if I could just say that, because
that's the chapter where I talk about retellings of the Ring, and they seem to me quite important that was there, because it goes to the heart of why I find it so fascinating, perhaps why so many of us find it so fascinating, which is that it can be told in so many different ways, all of which are satisfying. So I chose 5 particular retellings, and this was the chapter where I had to beat off the advice of editors and friends and colleagues who kept saying, you've simply got to mention that particular recording or that particular production. I said, no, I'm only going to include 5 retellings. And the 5 retellings I chose were one that happened less than a mile from here, the first American production conducted by Anton Seidel at the Metropolitan Opera, which of course then was on Broadway. And that was important for so many reasons. I then talk about the production that Wieland Wagner put on in 1951, the first production after the Second World War. And that strikes me as, in some ways, the most important production possibly there's ever been, in that if Wieland had got that wrong, the risk to Bayreuth of getting it wrong after their notorious association with the Third Reich was so great that Wieland had an extraordinary task to undertake, but he did get it right. And then I talk about the Georg Scholti recording of the Ring produced by John Culshaw, which strikes me as interesting as the most sustained effort to date to actually realize there are sounds we were talking about. And I go into some detail about how Culshaw, I mean, we talk about it as the Scholti Ring, but it was just as much the Culshaw Ring, the feet engineering. And then I talk about the Patrice Chéreau, Pierre Boulez ring, both because it was so important in itself, but also because I think it inaugurated probably a new era of retellings of the ring in it as it begins its second century of interpretation. And then finally I both literally returned because I went back to see the Herrheim ring again in 2024, but also I returned in the book to that ring and talk about some of the ways in which it epitomizes my ideas of what makes the ring so special. So I make no claim to authority in choosing those 5 retellings. They are simply 5 retellings that exemplified aspects of what I wanted to talk about. But it struck me as sort of important that chapter was there.
Give us page 152 then.
152. So 152 is there as an example of how I try and write about the music. So before we have 152, we should have some music. So we can't have an evening on the ring without some music. And so we're going to hear the end of the second scene of the prologue to Götterdämmerung, leading into the beginning of Siegfried's Weingeli. And rather wonderfully, so I've been playing this recorded at book talks around the UK. I chose it, to be honest, because it's conducted by Christian Thielemann, who's a Wagner conductor I admire. But serendipitously, it has Stephen Gould singing Siegfried, who's the co-author of a wonderful book which Peter has sort of edited and co-written, which I read recently, and commend to you all if you haven't yet read it. So it was rather nice when I realised that Stephen Gould was singing. So let's listen to about 2 or 3 minutes of music, and then I'll just read you what I wrote about this little passage. going after that. If the prologue's first scene, the scene with the Norns, is both a beginning and an ending, then the second is a beginning made to sound like an ending by Wagner's extraordinary music. As Siegfried prepares to set out on his adventures, he gives Brunhilde the ring that he took from Fafnir as a symbol of his devotion. They sing of their mutual love and their indissoluble union. Like the opening of Das Rheingold, this scene's exhilarating climax is in E-flat major, an apt connection since both passages depict a state of untroubled joy, briefly experienced before the malign intervention of a Nibelung, Alberic in Das Rheingold, his son Harvin in Götterdämmerung. And like much of the final act of Siegfried, this scene is in Wagner's most advanced post-Meistersinger style, the various love themes combined with such dexterity that the music almost overflows with melody. Wagner imbues this scene with so much contrapuntal richness, composing with such flexibility and apparent spontaneity, that the opening of the interlude, in which he depicts Siegfried's journey along the Rhine, seems shockingly plain by contrast, with its Mendelssohnian lightness, regular four-bar phrases, and simple texture, just one main melody, a version of Siegfried's horn call. Once again, time seems to travel in two directions at once. Wagner's music goes backwards, at least momentarily, to an earlier, simpler idiom, even as his story moves forwards.
Yeah, I can see why there are benefits to abjuring musical examples and instead forcing yourself
Yeah.
to articulate. Yeah. And can you give us page 244?
244, of course.
I mean, just as a thought.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, so 244 to 5 are the final paragraphs of the book. Obviously, the final paragraph of the book I try to sum up, but I sum up with my impressions of the Herrheim ring on the second time of seeing it. So I'll read you the last couple of paragraphs. Over the century and a half since Götterdämmerung was first produced, the apocalyptic events with which it concludes have been represented in numerous spectacular ways, from the crashing boulders of Otto Schenk's highly traditional 1980s production for the Met, to the tumbling cardboard boxes of Richard Jones's irreverent 1990s staging for Covent Garden. There is no shortage of visual excitement in Herrheim's production, but the final bars of the score are played by the orchestra in front of an almost empty stage. The actors have all departed, the sheets and suitcases have been cleared away, only the piano remains. The lighting rig is lowered below the proscenium, ready for the get-out. A solitary cleaner sweeps up the remaining debris. As the final chord ends, she pauses on her way across the stage, closes the lid of the piano, mirroring the gesture with which the cycle began, and gives it a quick dust. I find this image as moving as any I have seen all week. It reminds me that however much the spectacle we have just witnessed has enthralled the audience, and however deeply we have identified with it, it has been a piece of storytelling created by women and men who are singers, orchestral players, or theatre professionals, not gods or heroes. It reminds me, too, that the decades of individual effort that Wagner devoted to the creation of the Ring must be matched by a still greater collective investment of ours each time the work is mounted. But the cleaner's concern that everything is tidied away for the next performance also conveys her confidence that the story will begin again and will continue to be told.